Okay, we are going to look at the Last Supper in the Gospel account. This is part 2. In part 1, we looked at that yesterday about the date of the Last Supper. And this is going to be approximately at the time of Abib in the year of the crucifixion, and you will be able to find this study online at the website. Yes, in the Last Supper, part 1 is about the controversy over this date. Was it Abib 13 or Abib 14? And we discovered that it was not the 14th, that the Last Supper was indeed on Abib 13, and it was not a Passover meal. And in this study, we're going to be looking at the controversy over the bread. Was it unleavened bread or leavened bread? There's a lot of denominations and assemblies that are using leavened bread for their Last Supper celebrations. And the question is, which bread would represent Yahushua's body? Yes, the bread at the Last Supper table, was it leavened or unleavened, or was it both? Was there both kinds of bread there? It'll be a very interesting study as we go through it. We're going to have 3 witnesses today, 3 special witnesses. The first one is from Luke and the Emmaus account. We're going to again look at the Gospel of John, and I'm calling this the Second Supper table. And on the third witness, we'll look at patterns of type and antitype. But before we do any of that, that's about the last half of the presentation. We're going to do a very thorough examination of the Greek word for bread to find out what is happening there. So what is this controversy all about here in part 2? There is a question: can the type of bread that is used at the Last Supper be the item that will settle the controversy of whether or not the Last Supper was on Abib 13, or if indeed the Last Supper was eaten on Passover of Abib 14? So that was the question. You know, if you could just settle this issue of the bread, you could kind of figure out what was the date. And there are some arguments. If the bread was leavened, then the meal cannot qualify for the Passover meal that was usually eaten on Abib 14, where it is commanded that you must eat unleavened bread. Number 2 argument: if the bread is leavened, then the very last possible date for the Last Supper would have had to be Abib 13. But what if there is another option that needs to be considered that we don't really know about? And that's what we want to explore in this study today. We're going to look at a lot of definitions in the Hebrew and the Greek, but let's start with bread in Hebrew first. The word bread is lechem. It is 3899, and I'll pick out some of the definitions that stand out. Food, and it can be for man or beast, especially bread that is made from grain. And also you can see the word loaf is there. So this word lechem is going to come up a lot. Just keep that in mind. The Greek word for bread is artos. It is 740. Look at the definitions here. Bread as raised, or a loaf. And then the King James will also use shewbread, okay? Actually, in both Hebrew and Greek, you will see King James will use shewbread as well. Well, there is another Greek word for unleavened, and it's azumos. It is G106, and it is definitely unleavened or uncorrupted, specifically unleavened bread, and specifically for the Passover week. I want you to note that in the Greek text, azumos is never used in conjunction with bread, but only when identifying the festival of unleavened bread. That's an interesting thing to just keep that in mind. The Hebrew portion of this study is really important because the New Testament was translated from Hebrew into Greek for the Gentiles that could not read the Hebrew text. And so in this particular study, Hebrew is extremely important to find out what's going on. Now, there are different types of unleavened bread in the scriptures. 3 different types could be unleavened grain products, such as the unleavened bread wafers or crackers like this, flatbread, unleavened wafers that are actually cut and scored into small pieces. And then there's also unleavened cakes. Now, these are unleavened cakes. They look like a little leavened one, but they're called unleavened cakes. But in this study today, we're going to address only unleavened bread, not the cakes. There is different qualities between leavened and unleavened bread. And I want to just make a very, very brief announcement about this. The account that is given through Matthew, Mark, and Luke says that Yahushua broke bread, and that detail should not be overlooked. Yes, it's just literal language, and many times we understand it that breaking bread is just having a fellowship meal together. But let's take it literally. Leavened bread is not broken. It must be torn if you're going to share it with others. If you're not using a knife to cut it, you can't break it that easily. But unleavened bread or matzah, you can't tear it. If you've tried it, it just ends up breaking. So it's very interesting, broken bread. For these 3 gospel passages, the context alone declares that Yahushua broke unleavened matzah bread to serve all 12 of his disciples. Well, what about a little bit more of breaking bread? Remember, I said that Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record that Yahushua broke bread. However, John does not mention this detail. It's really interesting here that you're going to find a lot of differences between John and the Synoptic Gospels. John talks about dipping sop. It's a deliberate action to include only Judas, who was sitting next to him. Well, this dipping of the sop, was it a cultural courtesy? It's really interesting what C. Tenney has to say in the Expositor's Bible Commentary. Note what he says. For the host, such as Yahushua, to select such a tidbit from the main dish and give it to a guest would be a mark of courtesy and esteem. The disciples, seeing this, they would naturally conclude only that Yahushua regarded Judas as a friend that he had confidence in, a friend of utmost regard. Well, what about dipping bread? The qualities of unleavened bread and leavened bread are different when it comes to dipping. And further to that, John records that this bread was dipped, and it was dipped until it was sopping wet. Well, first of all, when unleavened bread is totally immersed in wine, oil, or a sauce, guess what? It doesn't soak up too well, it doesn't absorb too well, and it isn't much of a dip. It might just have something dripping off of it. But when you take leavened bread and you totally immerse it in wine, oil, or a sauce, it absorbs the dip very quickly and becomes sopping wet, as we would say. It doesn't take very long. Well, what do we know for sure about this night? Matthew, Mark, and Luke have clarity on 2 facts. Yahushua broke bread at the table of the Last Supper. There was a betrayer in the midst of the group. And the question is, how is that betrayer identified? There's going to be more information that is going to be very important, and we will gather all of the information. We will assemble it in correct order, and then we will form a conclusion. Leavened versus unleavened. In an attempt to determine whether that Last Supper was a Passover meal or not, many evangelicals today focus on the issue of whether the bread of the Last Supper was leavened or unleavened. In fact, you know what? Some of them say, if the bread was leavened, then the Last Supper qualifies for the pardon me, did I read that wrong? If the bread was unleavened, then the Last Supper qualifies for the Passover meal. However, the opposite is also true. If the bread was leavened, then the Last Supper could not have been the Passover meal. It's just that simple. But most are equating the bread with the meal. And I'm saying, how about, why don't we equate the bread with Yahusha? Maybe that's a better way to do this. So we want to review the Strong's definitions for bread, just as a reminder to you. In Hebrew, it is lechem. In Greek, it is artos. Remember I said it is especially bread. It is a loaf, and it also can include shewbread. And bread in the Greek is artos. That definition again is as raised or a loaf. It sure sounds like it's got some leaven in it when you look at the Greek. But I want you to note, nothing in either of these definitions in the Hebrew or the Greek indicates that the bread is always unleavened. In fact, both of the definitions can lean towards the leavened type of bread. So it's very, very unclear. There is a serious question, because leaven equals sin. Most often, we like to say, how can leavened bread then represent our sinless Yahusha? Most of us have the idea that leaven equals sin most often. And it's hard to understand how Yahusha, as saying that his body is the bread, how could his body be represented by leavened bread? Well, there's some things to remember for this study. Because the Greek and the Hebrew definitions seem very vague, there cannot be absolute clarity through that single option of looking at the definitions to figure out what kind of bread there is. A deeper study in the scripture is absolutely necessary to determine the answer to this question. And we have to also remember grammatical context of passages. This is extremely important. Yes, you have to go back to your English grammar days. We need to remember the scriptural patterns for the terms leavened and unleavened, and how these terms would link to type and antitype patterns. And remember that the type is a shadow picture, like the Passover lamb in Exodus 12 was a shadow picture of Yahusha as the antitype. Yahusha is the true. So we need to put these type and antitype patterns together, such as, number one, leaven in the scriptures most often represents sin. Number two, leaven also representing the change and the growth necessary to be fit for the kingdom of heaven. So leaven can also mean being fit for the kingdom of heaven. And number three, unleavening as a result of representing ridding of oneself of that sin. And next, we're going to have an examination of 5 different sections that apply the scriptural definitions, the grammatical context and content, and all the patterns. So I want to give you an introduction about the study topics that we're going to be looking at so you can kind of follow what's going on. This part of the study is going to compare the Hebrew and Greek definitions for the English word bread in an attempt to determine whether this bread is leavened or unleavened, or maybe both, in these following 5 categories. We're going to look at the manna. That's on slides 18 to 22. We're going to look at the sanctuary shewbread in slides 23 to 28, and we'll come back to the shewbread a little bit later. We're going to look at the consecration bread for the Aaronic priesthood. Was it leavened or unleavened? That is going to be a couple of slides. We will look at the loaves of Pentecost in slides 34 to 39 to see if they were leavened or unleavened. And then the breaking of bread in the account of the Emmaus walk on that wave sheaf day. That'll be about 10 slides. This search then will provide a foundation for the type of bread that was used in the Last Supper. And after we're all done with that, we're going to be ready to examine the gospel account, this bread used for the Last Supper, and it will be the last half of this presentation. It's the largest part of the whole study. So let's start with number 1, the manna, the bread that was from heaven. We will do a little bit of an introduction here on the manna, and then we're going to compare it to the Hebrew and to the Greek, and we'll make a conclusion. We'll do that at the end of each one of these 5 different partitions here. Number 1, the following information is based on a reasonable assumption that the manna given in the wilderness for 40 years was not leavened. This bread was to represent the Messiah that was to come, and his life would not be leavened with any sin of his own. And all are to partake of his perfect life, just as they were partaking of the manna in the wilderness. Therefore, it seems reasonable to assume that the manna was completely unleavened. But the question is, can this assumption be final? Really? Can we make an assumption like that and be on the safe side? Well, let's look at manna as bread in the Old Testament. We'll look at it in the New Testament as well, but we'll start here in Exodus 16. This is the first time that manna shows up. Then said Yahuwah unto Moses, Behold, I will rain bread, this is lechem, I will rain lechem from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain rate every day, that I may prove them, whether they will walk in my law or no. And when the children of Israel saw it, they said one to another, It is manna. But that means, what is it? It is manna, for they wist not what it was. And Moses said unto them, This is the bread, or this is the lechem, which Yahuwah has given to you to eat. Well, when you look up manna in the Hebrew, it is 4478. Literally, it's a whatness, or so to speak, it's manna. And it's called that way because of the question about what is it? So when you say manna, it really means what is it? The Hebrew definitions for 3899 bread and for 4478 manna, neither one of them specify if the manna is leavened or unleavened. However, we do know that ordinary bread is always leavened. So we're going to do a little summary for Hebrew manna. We found out that the Hebrew does not give absolute clarity if the manna was leavened. It just doesn't tell us. And the scriptural patterns may give clarity using type and antitype comparisons. So if we say that the manna is a type and it represents Yahusha as the antitype, or as the bread of life, having no sin of his own, we could say that the manna had to be unleavened. Therefore, the scriptural pattern for both type and antitype links to the concept of unleavened. And this pattern allows for the reasonable assumption that the manna was unleavened. At least that's what I think. Well, let's see if we can find something about manna as bread in the New Testament. And sure enough, there in John 6:31, he talks about it. He says, Our fathers did eat manna. It's G 31:31. Our fathers did eat manna in the desert, as it is written, He gave them bread, or artos, from heaven to eat. And when you look up manna in the Greek, it basically is just an edible gum. That's all it has to say. It doesn't really tell you much else. In John 6, the Greek word for artos is used when referring to manna from heaven as the lechem bread. Here the manna is definitely compared to a leavened type of bread using the Greek. The comparison of manna to lechem was not that specific as the Greek word artos was for leavened bread. Remember, there is no Greek term for unleavened bread, only for the feast of unleavened bread. That's important to remember as well. So what's our summary for Greek in the New Testament on the word manna? Well, the Greek appears to give absolute clarity that the manna was leavened. Would the scriptural patterns for type and antitype in the New Testament be different than the Old Testament? Well, the concept of leavened manna seems to break down here, at least it does for me. And it also appears that the pattern has been severely disrupted. So under this premise, is it safe to assume that the manna was leavened, saying that the New Testament Greek definitions take precedence over the type and antitype comparisons? That's a loaded question there. I would like you to note that the New Testament is a translation of the Hebrew into Greek, and in many cases, the Greek translation really does fail to give the full Hebrew concept. So we need to be careful when we're working in the New Testament with Greek. Let's go on to part number 2 about the showbread. This is a really interesting little section here. There were 12 loaves, and the loaves are lechem, 12 loaves of showbread in the holy place of the sanctuary that also represent the Messiah as the bread of life, because he was continuously in the presence of the Father. The week-old bread was replaced on Sabbath with freshly baked loaves. Every single Sabbath, they had brand new, freshly baked bread. Now, to us, it seems that the showbread would have had to be unleavened, or it would spoil before it was eaten a week later by the priests in the holy place. However, we need to remember that the presence of the Father can easily preserve leavened bread in that holy place, just as the pot of manna was preserved for decades and hundreds of years inside the Ark of the Covenant. Do the scriptures clarify the status of the showbread? And we're going to see that showbread is a combination of two words, and there's going to be two Hebrew definitions. But first of all, I would like you to consider this question. Did the showbread look like this, or was it 12 flat matzah that were to provide food for the full course of priests each week? Just think about it. If you had 12 flat matzah, would that be enough to feed all of the priests that were there for the whole week when they were working in the sanctuary? Interesting question. Well, let's look at showbread in the Old Testament. In Exodus 35:13, it says the table and his staves and all the vessels and the showbread. It means presence for show and lechem for bread. When you look up showbread, the show part is panim. It's plural. And it actually means the face as the part that turns. And then the bread part is lechem. We've already done that, especially bread from grain. It's like a loaf. And the example is that the showbread faces the presence of the Holy One in the sanctuary. And it's also known as bread of the presence. As with the manna, the showbread links back to the same Hebrew word, lechem, which can indicate either leavened or unleavened bread. And so that doesn't help us out one little bit. But pretty soon it's going to be shown that lechem, as a general term for any kind of bread, has to have a qualifier. It has to be qualified with that specific term, unleavened, which is matzah, before it can actually be unleavened bread. We're going to be looking at qualifiers. Don't forget that. So let's do our summary for the Hebrew showbread. Number one, the Hebrew does not give absolute clarity that the showbread had to be unleavened. That was kind of a surprise for me. And the scriptural patterns may give some clarity using type and antitype comparisons. But as with the manna, the showbread as a type represents Yahusha as the antitype, as the bread of life. And he had no sin of his own because he was the perfect Savior, and he was continuously in the presence of the Father. Therefore, the scriptural pattern for both type and antitype seems to link strongly to the concept of unleavened showbread. This pattern can allow for, again, a reasonable assumption that the showbread was unleavened, even though the definition for lechem leans toward leavened bread. And we're going to see if this assumption holds up or not. Maybe it will, and maybe it won't. Well, that's showbread for the Old Testament. What about showbread in the New Testament? Hebrews speaks of the sanctuary showbread as it is seen in Exodus, and as with the manna, the showbread also links to this word artos, which can indicate either leavened or unleavened bread. We just can't seem to get away from that artos. And even though artos can be leavened bread, this does not mean that the sanctuary showbread had to be leavened bread. And again, there's going to be two Greek definitions. In Hebrews 9:2, it says, "For there was a tabernacle made, the first wherein was the candlestick and the table and the showbread." And this is going to be prostheses and artos. It says this is all in the sanctuary. Well, the show part of showbread is prostheses, and it happens to mean a setting forth, specifically the showbread in the temple as exposed before Yahuwah, a setting forth. And there for bread, we have artos. Again, we know that artos is a raised loaf, and it also can have, in the King James, it can use it as showbread. Well, let's continue on this showbread investigation in the New Testament. Just as leaven can represent either the leaven of sin or leaven for the kingdom of heaven, so too the showbread could have represented the varied spiritual conditions of Israel. I found this to be very, very interesting. Many times in the Old Testament, Israel was in rebellion, completely leavened by the ways of the surrounding pagan nations. In fact, that's the story of the whole Old Testament after the Torah. Any bread or meal offerings that attended the blood sacrifices on the altar of burnt offering had to be unleavened. However, the showbread was never offered on the altar of burnt offering, but it was always eaten by the priests in a holy place. So there's a little bit of difference here between the showbread and a burnt offering, these meal offerings that go along with the burnt offering. I would like you to beware of comparisons that use the example of unleavened grain offerings upon the altar of burnt offering as the dictated rule that showbread has to always be unleavened. It just plain doesn't work. Now, this would be an acceptable rule if showbread was offered on the altar of burnt offering. Note, the grain offerings were always in the courtyard, and the showbread was always contained in the holy place. And there's a question to ponder here as well. Could this showbread also represent two different mandates of Yahusha, not just Israel? That's something to think about as well. Well, let's do our summary of the Greek showbread and see what we come up with. The Greek appears to give absolute clarity of leavened showbread, just like it did for the manna. Again, would that scriptural pattern for type and antitype in the New Testament be different than the Old Testament? The concept of leavened showbread seems to break down if we hold to the idea that the showbread was always unleavened because it represents the sinless life of Yahusha. It appears that the pattern has been severely disrupted. Under this premise, I'm asking the question, is it safe to assume that the showbread was leavened, saying that the New Testament Greek definitions take precedence over the Hebrew definitions, following the same pattern as the manna. That's exactly what Greek did with the manna, okay? So in conclusion, I'm going to have to say that so far there does not seem to be a specific scriptural guideline for the showbread. It is quite possible and logical that the showbread was either leavened or unleavened, as can be understood from a further study. And we're going to do a little tiny bit on that in a little bit. Not too much, it's a huge study. Let's look at section 3. This is about the consecration bread for the priesthood, and see if we can find anything of clarity. In Exodus 29, as well as in Leviticus 8, Moses was divinely directed to transfer his priestly duties to Aaron and his sons under the Aaronic priesthood. Remember, that was to happen after the golden calf. Part of the ceremony included the use of 3 different types of unleavened bread, called unleavened bread, unleavened cakes, and unleavened wafers. Now, anything to do with being unleavened is always matzah. You'll find that very easily, and we'll read some scriptures here in Exodus 29. And unleavened, which is matzah bread, unleavened bread, and the bread is lechem, so it's unleavened bread, and cakes unleavened, tempered with oil, and wafers unleavened, anointed with oil of wheaten flour, shalt thou make them. In verse 23, and 1 loaf of bread, and 1 cake of oiled bread, and 1 wafer out of the basket of the unleavened bread that is before Yahuwah. And thou shalt put all in the hands of Aaron, and in the hands of his sons, and you shalt wave them for a wave offering before Yahuwah. And thou shalt receive them of their hands, and burn them upon the altar for a burnt offering, for a sweet savor before Yahuwah. Are you noticing that unleavened is in there everywhere? Matzah, it is a qualifier. So consecration bread in the Old Testament, this is only for the Old Testament. There is nothing in the New Testament. It is always unleavened bread every single time. That definition of unleavened is 4682 matzah. And look what it says, in the sense of greedily devouring for sweetness, properly sweetness. That means it is not soured or bittered with yeast. It is an unfermented cake or loaf, and is specifically for the festival of Passover, because there was no leaven used then. And then in the King James, unleavened bread, unleavened cake, indefinitely without leaven. And of course, bread, we've looked at that. It's lechem, and it's just, there's nothing there to tell us that bread, lechem, is ever leavened or unleavened. It's just totally and completely open for discussion, needs to have a qualifier. Well, just a note on this consecration bread. All of the following were unleavened, or they were matzah, and all 3 types of unleavened product were in 1 basket, and it was called a basket of unleavened bread. In fact, no leavened bread went in that basket ever. And we know that bread was $38.99 lechem, especially bread, cakes that were called challah, and wafers that are rikik. It was a thin cake or a wafer. All 3 grain products for the consecration of the priests are noted again as lechem, and that Hebrew definition seems to indicate that none of the grain items are unleavened unless they are qualified by that term unleavened or matzah. Subsequently, every reference to manna, bread, cakes, wafers, or showbread cannot be understood as unleavened if matzah is absent. You cannot make that assumption. There is no New Testament counterpart for the use of unleavened bread, cakes, and wafers. for the consecration of priests to an earthly sanctuary, so you won't find anything there in the New Testament. And that's because Yahusha is now our high priest of the Melchizedek order. His sinless life links directly to and fulfills any unleavened item, be it grain or drink offerings. So we can do a Hebrew summary here for the consecration bread. We actually have a very good summary. The Hebrew gives absolute clarity that the consecration bread, the cakes and the wafers were unleavened, and they were taken from the basket of unleavened bread. These unleavened grain items were waved heavenward before they were ever laid on the altar of burnt offering. In fact, you need to remember that leaven of any sort was never placed on this altar. Never, ever. We're going to read about that a little bit later. The scriptural patterns do give clarity using type and antitype comparisons. And as with the manna and the shewbread, the unleavened consecration breads that are the type once again represent Yahusha as the antitype because he is the bread of life. Having no sin of his own, his perfect life was laid on the altar at the cross as an offering of a sweet savor to the Father. Definitely, the scriptural patterns for both type and antitype links very strongly to the concept of these unleavened consecrated breads. So there is absolutely no doubt regarding the leavening aspect, as the clarity is completely verified through the use of unleavened 4682 matzah. No assumptions are necessary whatsoever. We have complete clarity, and that's great. Let's go on to category number 4, the loaves of Pentecost. I would like you to notice that the Hebrew word for loaves is also lechem, as with the manna, the sanctuary shewbread, and the consecration bread. However, this time, the lechem is leavened bread. And guess what? It is qualified with the word leaven, so that you know absolutely for sure. In Leviticus 23:17, this is what it says. You shall bring out of your habitations 2 wave loaves, 2 lechems of 2/10 deals. They shall be of fine flour. Now look what it says. They shall be baken with leaven, shemetz. They are the first fruits unto Yahuwah. Just a little review here of bread. This $38.99 lechem, it never said anything there about being leavened or unleavened. So in this particular verse, we have the lechem being qualified as leavened bread. When you look up leaven, shemetz, it actually has this definition of ferment. It is leavened bread. No reason to have any doubt here whatsoever. So we can do a Hebrew summary for the Pentecost loaves. Just like with the consecration bread, the Hebrew, again, it gives absolute clarity that the Pentecost loaves were leavened. We don't have to make any assumptions at all. The 2 loaves of leavened bread were required, and they were presented as a thank offering being waved heavenward. The first fruit sheaves of wheat had been consecrated in its natural state, and the Pentecost loaves were from the new harvest of wheat. They were reaped, threshed, ground to flour, leavened, and then salted, kneaded, and baked. And this was all by human hands. The scriptural patterns do give clarity using type and antitype comparison. This leavened type definitely represents Yahusha as what? The great teacher. His life, mixed with the life of individuals, represents truth and spirit-filled people preaching the gospel for the kingdom of heaven. Only Yahusha's spirit-filled leaven can change the sinner to reflect him. As with the consecration bread, there is absolutely no doubt regarding the leavening aspect, as the clarity is completely verified through the use of leaven and this word shemetz. There's no assumptions that are necessary at all. So that's the easy part. Well, let's do a little Hebrew summary for the Pentecost loaves. We're just continuing it. So far, the Hebrew has shown that lechem bread can be either leavened or unleavened. If the leaven is not qualified, if the lechem is not qualified with the terms matzah for unleavened bread or with the term shemet for leavened bread, it cannot be said with exact certainty what type the lechem bread would be. At that point, one would have to carefully consider these scriptural patterns of type and antitype. You'd have to go back and figure that out, or you would have to look at the context of a passage, which is exactly what has to be done in the next section. We're going to look at these contexts in the contents of these verses. But let's go back to the showbread first and consider some other options. Remember, I said to you that we were going to come back to the showbread question just for a little bit. Just to review, the consecrated loaves for the Aaronic priests were unleavened, being qualified by that term matzah. Remember that? The Pentecost loaves were leavened, and they were qualified by the term shemets. The 12 loaves of showbread in the holy place of the sanctuary represent the Messiah as the bread of life. And I'm going to say without sin, because often leaven represents sin. But his life was also given for the leaven of the kingdom of heaven. He stands continuously in the presence of the Father for this purpose. Do the scriptures clarify the status of the showbread? And I'm going to say, no, I cannot find anything. There is no qualifier for this bread to be either leavened or unleavened. Maybe a further study, somebody can find it, but I couldn't find anything about this showbread being either or. But here's this question about this showbread. How would 12 flat matzah provide food for the full course of the priesthood for a complete week? And we all know that leavened bread is much more tastier to eat than unleavened bread, especially every week of the year. Let's look at a little bit something different about baking the showbread. This is from the Temple Institute, and this was from February of 2020. And I'd like you to listen to this quote because it's very interesting that it almost sounds like this bread was raised or leavened. Here we go. It was also discovered that each time the Hebrew word solet is used in the Torah, it signified the method with which the flour was ground, specifically as fine flour. Since Torah forbids the use of yeast in the holy temple, and I want you to notice what the article goes on to say, other leavening agents were necessary. 40 minutes is required for the kneading process. And you might remember that kneading for that long is going to cause something to happen in that bread dough. And we all know that unleavened bread doesn't need that much kneading. It goes on to say that the bread is baked in large ovens, 40 centimeters by 80 centimeters with 8 centimeters thick walls. Gemara relates that a recurring miracle guaranteed that the showbread remained fresh for 1 week from the day it was baked without the need for closed storage or refrigeration. And you all know that unleavened bread doesn't spoil like that, does it? But anyway, he has a recipe that has succeeded in maintaining the freshness for the duration of a whole week, okay? The shape of the bread is achieved by using baking forms as it was done in the Holy Temple. 2 different shapes have been produced by Professor Amar, the konne shape as depicted on ancient Chasmonian coins, the shape known as tava prutza, the shape of an inverted Hebrew letter ket. And I have a question. Are there any requirements during the Feast of Unleavened Bread about what kind of showbread is in the holy place of the sanctuary? If it's during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, would this be a different kind of bread in the sanctuary? That is a very good question. So let's do some conclusions for this showbread. The research that I have completed so far shows that the sanctuary showbread could have been unleavened, or the sanctuary showbread could have been leavened. It could have been either way. And depending on Yahusha's purpose, leavened or unleavened bread would be determined by the context. If that is so, you need to ponder another question. What kind of bread would be placed in the holy place during the 7 days of Unleavened Bread festival, which will usually include some cycles of 2 weeks? I wonder what they did. That is an interesting question. Was it raised bread? Was it matzah? Or was there provision for both? And also I did find some indications that when Israel was in rebellion, that the showbread was definitely leavened, and when they weren't in rebellion, that it was unleavened. I don't know. It's just some interesting information. So that completes our introduction to the showbread. And that completes our whole introduction to this Hebrew and Greek little search to see what's going on. So now let's get to our 3 witnesses. The first witness is going to be for this word artos in the Greek, and we're going to look at Luke's gospel, specifically the Emmaus account. Because there was bread involved in this Emmaus account. This is number 5 of our categories, but we're sort of double dipping here, doing first witness in the 5th category. Up to this point, there is absolutely no doubt that the Greek word for bread, which is artos, can be used to describe leavened or unleavened bread. In the account from Luke, the context will be the determining factor for either leavened or unleavened bread. Remember, I keep talking about context. Well, there were 2 followers of Yahusha, and they decided to return to Emmaus that very same day that they heard their master had risen. And the events of this account occurred during the Passover festival. Let's read some of these main verses before we go into breaking this open. It's found in Luke 24. Now, upon the first day of the week, very early in the morning, they, this is the women with the spices, came unto the sepulchre, bringing the spices which they had prepared, and certain others with them. And they found the stone rolled away from the sepulchre. And they enter in, and they found not the body of Yahusha. He is not here, but is risen. Remember how he spake unto you when he was yet in Galilee, saying, the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men, and be crucified, and the 3rd day rise again. And they remembered his words. And they returned from the sepulchre, and told all these things, that he was risen, even unto the 11, and to all the rest. In verse 13, and behold, 2 of them, these are some of the followers that you find in verse 9, went the same day. I will tell you, it was Abib 18. They went the same day to a village called Emmaus, which was from Jerusalem about 80 furlongs. And they talked together of all these things which had happened. And it came to pass that while they communed together and reasoned, Yahusha himself drew near and went with them. And it came to pass, as he sat at meat with them, he took bread, he took artos, and he blessed it, and he brake, and he gave it to them. And their eyes were opened, and they knew him, and he vanished out of their sight. And they told what things were done on the way. If you skip a couple verses down to 35, they told what things were done in the way, and how he was known of them in breaking this artos bread. It says artos bread. Are you wondering about the use of artos here as leavened bread? Because that's what the Greek says for artos, basically a raised loaf. Well, we're going to look at these first 5 days of Passover at this point in time. We have just part of the feast. We have the 4th day, which was the midst of the week, and that was the Passover crucifixion. That was an Abib 14. That is day 1 of the 8 days of the Passover festival. The next day was a Thursday. It was the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It was Abib 15, day number 2. On the 6th day, we have Friday, which is the preparation for the weekly Sabbath, Abib 16. And then, of course, the weekly Sabbath follows on Abib 17. That is day number 4. And then we have the resurrection on that day. And of all things, this first day of the week comes along, and it is the first fruits festival, or the wave sheaf. That is also the ascension of Yahusha. And this is the day where Yahusha joins the 2 travelers. It is day number 5 of the 8. But the Feast of Unleavened Bread starts here on Abib 15, okay? You will see that this is actually a feast of 7 days. And look at the wave sheaf is on actually the middle day of the Unleavened Bread week. It is the middle day, is the 4th day out of the 7 days. A very important concept. Well, let's look at some facts for this Passover Spring Festival of the Emmaus account. Abib 14 to 21 represents those 8 inclusive days for the full festival, even though I'm showing only 5 of the days in the chart. But Abib 15 to 21 represent the 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Only unleavened bread, cake, or wafers are eaten during these days. Guess what? That's going to include Abib 18, the first cycle of the week, as the wave sheaf. The women and the disciples and others discover that their master is not in the tomb. And later on the same day in the evening, you all know that Yahusha meets up with those 2 disciples walking to Emmaus, and he accepts their invitation to dine with them for the evening meal. When he sat down, it says that Yahusha broke bread, broke artos, and that was when they recognized him. This artos bread was definitely not leavened bread. As Abib 18, remember what I told you, it is exactly the middle day of the Unleavened Bread week. And any Torah keeper and follower of Yahusha would not be serving leavened bread to their guests during the week of unleavened bread. You can be sure about that. In fact, I bet you there wasn't any unleavened bread in all of Israel. However, the Greek word artos for bread is used here in the New Testament. And we all know that that was defined as leavened bread. So what in the world happened here? Did these 2 disciples of Yahusha really serve him leavened bread during the week of unleavened bread? Do you really think that happened? We have already seen in previous examples that artos can have the dual meaning of leavened or unleavened bread. And in the Emmaus account, this artos was absolutely unleavened. You can say that for sure, because the qualifier is the context. Well, let's look at a summary for Luke's account here. That Greek word for unleavened is not artos, it's azumos. It means unleavened, uncorrupted, and specifically for the Passover week. I'm sure many are wondering why Luke's account for the unleavened bread eaten on Abib 18, why was it not linked to G106, azumis, that actually means unleavened? The New Testament uses the word azumis for unleavened more in the connection with the festival than with the type of bread. And there is a reason for this that we're going to examine next. But let's return to the 4th day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. We want to take a little bit further look here. Remember, this Greek word for unleavened is azumos, and in Hebrew, it's matzah. On the 4th day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the bread being broken by Yahusha is azuman. There are very likely no leavened bread artos in the whole land of Israel for the entire 7-day feast of unleavened bread. Remember, azuman is Greek and matzah is Hebrew. In Luke's account, the surviving Greek texts read artos, which is the common word for the normal leavened bread. And this appears to be a simple oversight by those who copied or translated the original Greek text. Now, how did this happen? There are many variations of the New Testament writings where the best Greek word was replaced with, look, a very similar Greek word that was more in accord with the local language when the manuscript was copied. So the question is, what is Koine Greek? The Greek dialect aimed at the common people is called Koine. Okay, it's not like a high Greek, it's an everyday Greek. When there seems to be a conflict, as in this account with Luke, then the full and proper understanding must be taken back to the Torah and back to the Hebrew definitions. These variations in the Greek text do not always degrade the text, but rather help us to understand why it is so important. Why is it so important to choose the definition that fits the context and the content of each verse when there seems to be a discrepancy? A summary for Luke's Emmaus account, we're going to conclude it now. Even though the Greek word for bread and artos holds the definition of leavened bread, the context of this passage overrules that definition. We have to go with the context. The context is king. Context is this was the middle day of the unleavened bread week, and nobody's going to be serving leavened bread on that day. And we can be thankful. For Luke, recording this event on the road to Emmaus, he's the only one that records it in a lot of detail, like 21 verses, where others will have 1 or 2 verses. But this one testimony is the red flag that's going to set everything straight. Why? Because otherwise, it would be so easy to say that the leavened bread represented Yahushua's flesh with our sins. And I want you to remember that our sins do not make his flesh sinful. They never have, and they never will. Let's look at some conclusions regarding bread in both the Hebrew and the Greek. The Hebrew word for bread, or lechem, is used for both leavened and unleavened bread. The Greek word for bread, artos, also refers to both leavened or unleavened bread. Therefore, to understand if bread is leavened or unleavened, the Hebrew and the Greek definitions cannot always stand alone. We have to take the context and most seriously give it consideration. The scriptural patterns of type and antitype must be in full alignment. And all 3 of these steps are important to find the true definition of a passage. So the general summary for this section is going to be, we have seen several times where the Greek word for bread, or artos, is used to identify both leavened and unleavened bread. This very same word artos is mentioned in the account for the Last Supper. So far, it has been shown that the Hebrew definition of the word lechem is not strictly unleavened bread unless it uses a qualifier and it's combined with matzah. And likewise, lechem is not strictly leavened bread unless it's combined with shemetz. Those are 2 very important things to remember. In Greek, azumas is the best word to indicate unleavened bread if the text would not use Koine Greek. That would have been really nice if they would have used that other word. We will consider the verifying factor of type and antitype patterns after taking a careful look at the Last Supper in the 4 Gospels. We are now ready to go into the second witness for Artos bread study. And this is about John's Gospel and the second sitting at the supper table. This is a really interesting part of the study. Connecting the Emmaus testimony to the Last Supper. In Luke's Emmaus account, the Hebrew word for bread was not translated into the Greek azumos to indicate unleavened bread. That Greek word artos was used, and we already know for sure that it can take on either definition of leavened or unleavened bread. There was bread at the Last Supper, but as to leavened or unleavened, this is not to be determined by observing only the Greek definitions used for bread. And with a careful look at the account given in John, perhaps this questionable area is going to reveal another clear answer by again considering the context and the scriptural patterns. There are some things that you need to watch for in the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke record Yahusha breaking and blessing artos bread, which appears to be leavened bread. But John is different. He does not record Yahusha breaking or blessing artos bread. Remember, I have said over and over again, John is very careful about how he records things. In fact, John doesn't record anything about the supper table where the bread and the wine emblems were offered by Yahusha in remembrance of him. And it is extremely important to note this stark omission by John. Like, why in the world did he not document such important information? Well, John has other information. Reminder, John records nothing about the event where bread and wine were given to the disciples. Matthew, Mark, and Luke did all of that. After the supper was ended, Yahusha washed the feet of all 12 disciples. Then he returned to his place at the supper table and he sat down again. And only then does John record artos bread in connection with giving it to Judas, and he accepts. This artos bread was not blessed and it was not broken by Yahusha. John does not record that Yahusha ate any of it, but merely the fact that Judas was going to accept this artos bread in his presence. And a few verses later, John connects this artos bread with the sop. And this sop was dipped in a very interesting way. There are some questions to ponder before we look at that sop. We need to think about it before, during, and after reading these four Gospels. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that artos bread that Yahusha blessed and broke and gave to all, representing his broken and perfect body, was this really leavened bread, like the Greek definition suggests, or was it unleavened bread, according to scriptural patterns? Number two, did Judas eat of this bread at the Last Supper ordinance, that bread that was blessed by Yahusha? We're going to compare the Synoptic Gospels to John. He shows the artos bread was dipped by Yahusha until it was soaking wet, and then it was given to Judas. That artos bread was also described as a sop, or just a morsel of bread, a small bite, just a mouthful. Was this leavened bread, as the Greek definition suggests, or was it unleavened bread? And where are the scriptural patterns to show us the context? And the other question is, why didn't the other disciples get any of this dipped bread? Why were they left out? After the foot washing, which disciples in the group were spiritually clean or spiritually unclean according to Yahusha's words? Number 6, in other words, which disciples would be considered unleavened from sin or leavened with sin, even though they had all taken part of the bread and the wine emblems? Remember the scriptural types and antitypes. When Yahusha himself compares the bread and the wine emblems to himself, What kind of bread would he have used for this divine comparison? Remember, when it comes to the use of the Greek word artos, bread, context must be king. So now we're ready to go into the exciting part. We're going to look at the four Gospels. There's going to be two columns, one on the left and one on the right. We'll go through Matthew first, and then I'll show you how it works. Matthew 26, 20 to 25, he has 11 verses. He says, "Now when the even was come, he sat down with the 12. And as they did eat, he said, Verily I say unto you, that one of you shall betray me. And they were exceedingly sorrowful, and began every one of them to say unto him, Master, is it I? And he answered and he said, He that dippeth his hand with me in the dish, the same shall betray me. The Son of Man goeth as it is written of him. But woe unto that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It had been good for that man if he had not been born. Then Judas, which betrayed him, answered and said, Master, is it I? And he said unto him, Thou hast said." Okay, I would like you to pay attention to this right-hand column. In verse 20, it says, Yahushua sits down with 12 disciples. In 21, it says, One of you will betray me. In 22, everyone asked, Is it I? And he responds, He who dips in the dish is the betrayer. And finally, Judas asked if he was the betrayer. The answer is yes. And the question is, did Yahushua answer in such a way as to expose Judas to the whole group? Now, as we go through Mark and Luke, I want you to just watch this right column, because they're going to be basically all the same, and we will compare it to what John does. Let's continue on in Matthew. We have a little bit more to do. As they were eating, Yahushua took artos bread, and he blessed it, and he brake it, and he gave it to the disciples. And he said, Take, eat, this is my body. And a question here for verse 26. Would Yahushua really use leavened bread to represent his body that had absolutely no leaven of sin? Verse 27. And he took the cup, and he gave thanks, and he gave it to them, saying, Drink ye all of it. And a comment for verses 27 to 29 is going to be the same. Most understand that the grape juice in the cup was unfermented or unleavened to represent the blood of our sinless Messiah. But let's read about it. He says, For this is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. But I say unto you, I will not drink henceforth of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. And when they had sung a hymn, they went out into the Mount of Olives. And I would just like you to note that there is no record of foot washing in the book of Matthew. None whatsoever. Well, that was Matthew. Let's look at Mark. He has 10 verses describing this event. In the evening, when he cometh with the 12. So I'm not going to read all of it right here, right now, but you can see that we have these same categories. Yahushua sits down with 12 disciples. He says, One of you will betray me. And everybody asked, Is it I? And then in verse 20, he answered and he said unto them, It is one of the 12 that dippeth with me in the dish. He who dips in the dish is the betrayer. That's what it has there in Mark. We saw those same questions coming up, those same comments. Continuing on in Mark 22, and as they did eat, Yahushua took bread, it was artos, and he blessed and brake it, and he gave it to them. And he said, Take, eat, this is my body. And again, the questions are, what kind of bread would really represent the unleavened, sinless body of Yahushua? And what kind of drink in the cup would represent the unleavened blood of Yahushua's body, leavened or unleavened? And basically, Mark records about the same thing as Matthew. And again, there is no record of foot washing in the book of Mark. Well, let's take a look at Luke. He has 10 verses that describe this event. And again, the same thing. We have Yahushua sitting down with his 12 disciples, but Luke has something interesting here. Let me read it in verse 15. He had sat down with the 12, and then he said, with desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. We're going to look at this in a lot more detail a little bit later on. And it says, he took the cup and he gave thanks, and he said, divide this among yourselves. For I say unto you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of Elohim shall come. I want you to notice that Luke records the drink of this cup is divided in preparation for drinking it later. The other Gospels do not do that. Let's continue on in Luke. And he took artos bread and gave thanks, and he brake it. This is my body, which is given for you. This do in remembrance of me. So I just want to make a note here in Luke that first the bread is taken. He does exactly the same as Matthew and Mark. He did talk about the cup there earlier, but first the bread is taken. And the same questions as before always apply about the bread and the wine. Would only the fruit of the vine be unleavened to represent the sinless Savior and not the bread? Anyway, in verse 20, he says, likewise, also the cup after supper, saying, this cup is the New Testament in my blood, which is shed for you. But behold, the hand of him that betrayeth me is with me on the table. There we have, one of you will betray me. And again, everyone is inquiring among themselves which of them it was that would do this thing. Everyone wanted to know who is the betrayer. Basically the same things as we saw in Matthew and Mark. And again, there is absolutely no record of the foot washing. But now what you've all been waiting for is the book of John. He doesn't have 10 or 11 verses. He has 31 verses recording something that was going on here in John chapter 13. And only John records the foot washing. He does not specifically mention the bread and the wine at the first sitting of the supper table. He begins when the supper had ended, that last supper had ended. It was the supper where the unleavened bread and the wine emblems were given to the disciples. He doesn't talk about that. Let's see what John has to say. We're going to read verse 1. He says very specifically, now before the feast of the Passover, when Yahushua knew that his hour was come, that he should depart out of this world unto the Father, having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them unto the end. Verse 2, very important. And supper being ended, the devil having now put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. Yahushua, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he was come to Elohim and went to Elohim, he riseth from supper and laid aside his garments, and he took a towel. Do you notice that? In verse 4, Yahushua rises from the supper table to wash all the disciples' feet. And remember that Judas is there. It's very important to see the events, how they lay out. Verse 5, after that he poureth water into a basin, and he began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel wherewith he was girded. So in verse 5, we find that Yahushua is going to be washing the feet of 12 disciples. Now, I remember I told you, I want you to watch what the comparison is on the right column in the book of John as what you had seen in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We're going to continue in verse 6. Then cometh he to Simon Peter, and Peter saith unto him, Master, dost thou wash my feet? And Yahushua answered, and he said unto him, What I do thou knowest not now, but thou shalt know hereafter. And Peter saith unto him, Thou shalt never wash my feet. And Yahushua answered him, If I wash thee not, thou hast no part with me. And then Simon Peter saith unto him, Master, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. And Yahusha saith to him, this is saying to Peter, he that is washed needeth not save to wash his feet, but is clean every whit, and ye are clean, but not all. This is the first clue that there is a betrayer in the group. Do you remember how many times Matthew, Mark, and Luke said that there was a betrayer in the group? Do you remember it was just once? Well, let's see what John is going to do. In verse 11, for he knew who should betray him. Therefore he said, ye are not all clean. He was talking about Judas. There's a clue of the betrayer. So after he had washed their feet and had taken his own garments and was set down again, he said unto them, know ye what I have done to you? I need you to notice verse 12. This is the second time that Yahusha is at the table. Now, this is very likely a round table, according to how the events are all recorded. And we all understand that they would recline around a table at a supper. And when Yahusha got up, he would have gone around the table washing each of their feet while they were still at that table. They wouldn't get up and do it like we do today. But this is very important that this was very likely a round table. In fact, it couldn't work any other way. In verse 13, you call me teacher and master, and ye say, well, for so I am. If I then, your teacher and master, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. So right here, the instructions for the ordinance of foot washing are given. And this was after the bread and the wine were taken, the bread and the pure drink. Verse 16, verily, verily, I say unto you, the servant is not greater than his Lord, neither is he that sent greater than he that sent him. If you know these things, happy are ye if you do them. I speak not of you all. I know whom I have chosen, but that the scripture may be fulfilled. He that eateth bread, and it's artos, he that eateth artos with me hath lifted up his heel against me. There's your second clue that there is a betrayer in the group. Verse 19, now I tell you before it come, that when it come to pass, you may believe that I am he. Very verily I say unto you, he that receiveth whomsoever I send receiveth me, and he that receiveth me receiveth him that sent me. Oh, John is going to get very interesting. I want you to watch that right-hand column. In verse 21, when Yahusha had said thus, he was troubled in his spirit and testified and said, verily, verily, I say unto you, that one of you shall betray me. There is clue number 3, that there is a betrayer in the group. How many more times? Verse 22, then the disciples looked one on another, doubting of whom he spake. And I want you to note in verse 22 that no other gospel writer reports that the disciples did not know who the betrayer was. Let's look and see what happens here. Verse 23, now there was leaning on Yahusha's bosom one of his disciples, and it was John, whom Yahusha loved. I want you to note John's position with Yahusha. He was leaning on his bosom. He loved his master so much. He was as close as he could possibly get. Verse 24, Simon Peter therefore beckoned to him. Now remember, Peter and John were pretty close friends. Simon Peter beckoned to John that he should ask who it should be of whom he spake. I have a note here. Peter urges John to find out who the betrayer is, since he's the closest in position. Can you just see Peter across the table, nodding to John, giving him eye contact and saying, you know what? You find out. Who is it? Who's the betrayer? You're right there. Just ask the question, But anyway, verse 25. John, then lying on Yahusha's breast, saith unto him, did he say it like this, everyone? Master, who is it? Or do you think John said, Master, who is it? You know, John does ask the question, but I'm pretty sure it was silently, as it's going to be noted very shortly. I do not think that John asked it loudly. I think that John was so close to Yahusha that his mouth was right there at his ear. And John said, Master, who is it? And Yahusha answered, How do you think, in a soft voice? He it is to whom I shall give the sop when I have dipped it. And when he had dipped the sop, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. You know, I believe that Yahusha answers John quietly so that he does not expose the betrayer by name. The dipped sop is involved, and Judas must have been sitting on the other side of Yahusha. Now, why am I bringing this to your attention? Do you remember what Tenny said about dipping the sop and giving it to somebody sitting next to you? It was a thought of high regard. Let's read verse 27. And after the sop, Satan entered into Judas. Then said Yahusha unto him, That thou doest, do quickly. There's the fourth clue that there's a betrayer in the group. We're watching this right side of the column. Verse 28 is extremely important. Look what John records that nobody else records. Now, no man at the table knew for what intent he spake this unto Judas. John is the only one that records that none other of the other disciples know why Judas leaves. Remember, dipping that sop and giving it is something of high regard. Now look what verse 29 says. For some of them thought, or you could say, for some of them assumed, because Judas had the bag that Yahusha had said unto him, buy those things that we have need of against the feast, or that he should give something to the poor. And Yahusha still does not expose Judas for who he really is, but he only tells him to act quickly. Remember, they're all expecting to have Passover together the next day. In verse 30, he then, having received the sop, went immediately out, and it was night. There's your fifth clue that there is a betrayer in the group, and Judas leaves. Therefore, when he was gone out, Yahusha said, Now is the Son of Man glorified, and Elohim is glorified in him. Well, you know what? It's time to take our study back to the bread. We need to find out what's going on with this bread. We've read the four accounts in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Luke 22:19 bread is artos. Remember in Luke 22, the Emmaus, when he took the bread and he gave thanks and he brake it and he gave unto them saying, This is my body. There are several issues that we need to take note of right here. And that definition for the Greek word artos does indicate only leavened bread, because we already know that this word is also used for unleavened bread. It can be either way. And we also know there is a Greek word that could have been used for unleavened bread. It's azumos, but the translators did not make that choice. In part one of our study, we determined that the Last Supper was the day before the Passover festival. And guess what? At this point in time, everyone is still allowed to eat leavened bread if they want to. There is nothing that says that you cannot eat leavened bread on the 13th day of the first month. However, with that being said, the Jews were preparing for the Passover festival. Many were arriving 6 days early, and they likely still had a good supply of leavened products in their dwelling places on Abib 13. That would also include unleavened bread, cakes, and wafers, because they would be preparing for the spring festival, or they would have purchased something. A study on leaven most often indicates the leaven of sin. However, leaven can also represent the leaven for the kingdom of heaven. We need to remember that as well. Well, let's go back to John. John said, not all are clean. There were two groups of people after that foot washing, most in a clean position and one in a filthy. Would you say that that clean condition was unleavened and that filthy condition was leavened with sin? In John 13:10 and 11, Yahushua said to him, "He that is washed needeth not save to wash his feet, but he is clean every whit. And ye are clean, but not all." For he knew who should betray him. Therefore he said, "Ye are not all clean." And even though all of his disciples, all 12 of them, had their feet washed by Yahushua, the betrayer was still leavened with sin. But we all know that John is going to be different. If there's one gospel that's different, it's always John. John's account of the Last Supper is a bit different than Matthew, Mark, or Luke. In John's account of the Last Supper, there is only one verse that uses artos. It's in verse 18. "I speak not of you all. I know whom I have chosen, but that the scripture may be fulfilled. He that eateth artos with me has lifted up his heel against me." There is no written account that Yahushua ate or drank anything that evening. However, one of the disciples that was with him accepted this bread and he ate it. And we're going to have even more documentation about that. It is interesting that John has not given a detailed account of the actual bread that Yahushua gave to all his disciples. He's expecting you and I to figure it out. And in verse 18, he mentions the bread at the first supper table in connection with that betrayer. Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not mention the bread given to the betrayer. However, all three of them mention the bread that was eaten in remembrance of their master. So we're just going to take some time to remember just kind of what we've gone through here. Just a little bit of review. This Greek word artos, it attempts to describe the unleavened bread of Torah. In the Synoptic Gospels, artos appears to describe Yahushua's body, which was given and broken for us, which we know was without sin, and it was without leaven. It just doesn't seem like the very best word. And we want to note, just because artos appears in the Synoptic Gospels, and we can't say that it's talking about leavened bread. Do we dare question if this is really bread with leaven? Can we do that? Because we have to look at type and antitype. Well, let's do some gospel comparisons between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke write about Yahushua sitting at the supper table one time. Not John. He records sitting at the supper table 2 distinct times. Number 2, Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not record the foot washing ceremony, but John records that Yahushua washes all the disciples' feet, including Judas. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Yahushua gives only one clue of who the betrayer is, but in John, 5 clues are given about who the betrayer is. Do you want to keep going? Number 4. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record bread being broken at the supper table. None of them record the sop that was being dipped. John does not record bread being broken at the first supper table, but he does mention the betrayer ate bread in his presence at the first supper table. John does talk about the sop being dipped with the betrayer at the second sitting of the supper table after that foot washing ceremony. John is very different. Point number 5. Matthew, Mark, and Luke seem to indicate that all the disciples knew that Judas was the betrayer. Let me read that again. Matthew, Mark, and Luke seem to indicate that all the disciples knew that Judas was the betrayer, but not John. John makes it very clear that Yahushua did not expose or embarrass Judas to the whole group, but rather he gave Judas every opportunity to confess and repent of his planned deed. He was most kind. we need to take a little closer look at John. Let's consider the details in John a little more closely and see if there's another option to this controversy over the bread. It's in verse 26. Yahusha answered, he it is to whom I shall give a sop. It's 55:96. When I have dipped, it's 9:11. When I have dipped it. And when he had dipped the sop, do you notice it's a different word? When he had dipped the sop, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. Let's look at some of these definitions. Sop, it's 55:96. Samion, it is from a base of 55:97. It's a crumb or a morsel or a mouthful, just a mouthful, something that was dipped. Now we have two words for dipped. They are very different numbers. Let's look at the first one. I shall give a sop when I have dipped it. It's bapto. It means to overwhelm, to cover wholly with a fluid. And in the New Testament, look what it says. Only in a qualified or specially sense. Qualified, everybody, to moisten, to make this bread wet, dripping wet. But there is another word, dipped. It has a different number, 1686. It's embapto, and it means to whelm on, to wet. You know what I think? It's there two times, not once. And when it's there twice, it means you got to remember what something's going on here, something really important. And I think it means that this bread was dipped long enough for the item to be soaking wet, not just moistened. It was dripping wet. So we have some semi-final conclusions here. In part one of this study, we found that the Last Supper did indeed take place on Abib 13, and we know that the disciples were asked to prepare for the Passover, even though they didn't understand what was going on. Point number 3, they would have purchased some unleavened bread for the Passover meal that they were planning to eat the next day. There would have been unleavened bread in that upper room. Don't forget that the local homes could still be cleaned of leaven on Abib 14 before the Passover meal in the evening. So there was no reason that all leavened products had to be out of the room on Abib 13. There was no command like that. So it was totally okay to have leavened products in that upper room. Therefore, having leavened bread at the table that was used by Yahusha to dip the sop for Judas, that was not an issue at all. However, Yahusha would not, and he did not use leavened bread to represent his body at that first setting of this table. According to the definition for the sop that was dipped, it would have had to be leavened morsel of bread that soaked up a lot of dip. Only Judas received this sop, indicating that he was totally leavened with sin. Totally leavened. The only one in the group that was leavened with sin. Well, you know how it is. John always seems to have the final word. Let's see what we have to pick up on our review if some have missed it from the last study. John's gospel was written around 90 to 100 AD. It was written long after the Synoptic Gospels. In fact, the way I understand it, it was the last book written in the New Testament. And John's focus was to take the message of the Messiah to the Gentile world, and they were all living under Roman rule. His work would have been translated into Greek, as the majority, if not all of the Gentile world, did not read Hebrew. And could it be, dear ones, that when he was reading Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that those transcripts were already translated into Greek, that he already saw some problems there? Remember, the Koine Greek was used to translate the Hebrew, and often Koine Greek does not supply the words or the terms for a full and proper understanding of what's going on. This is very evident through this word artos that is used to define both leavened and unleavened bread. And while this might seem like a very small detail, there is a very huge difference in the final meanings. So John is really careful in his record of how he uses the word bread. By the time he compiles his gospel, he must have realized that this problem exists in the synoptic writings because of this Koine Greek. So John uses terminology for the Last Supper that removes any trace of linking leavened artos bread with his master Yahusha. John is the only one that records that not one of the rest of the disciples knew exactly who the betrayer was, except himself. And isn't this just the sweet way of Yahusha? To gently give every opportunity to the erring one for repentance. And should that not happen, to not deliberately expose and embarrass the individual to the whole rest of the group. I can just see Yahusha being so very kind. 2 supper tables. Let's do just a little summary. The Synoptic Gospels, they have a first supper table with the unleavened bread and the unleavened drink. Then came the foot washing service. It connects the events of the 2 separate supper tables. In John's account, he just has the second sitting at the supper table, but John's going to tell you about the sop that was dipped, and it was dipped really good, soaking wet. In the first supper table of the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke record the breaking of artos bread, receiving the wine. There is one mention of a betrayer in the group. There is an appearance that everyone knows who the betrayer is, and there's no mention of leaving the supper table for the foot washing. And each one of them have an average of 10 or 11 verses that record the events of the first supper table. But when you look at the second sitting of the supper table and compare it to John, it's a little bit different. John uses 31 verses to record the events of the second supper table. John's record is very, very different. He records this event is before the Passover day. He only records the first supper of emblems is ended. There is no mention of the breaking of the bread or the receiving of the wine. He mentions Judas specifically when the first supper is ended. He's the first one that gets mentioned. And only John records the foot washing after the first supper with the emblems. And then John records Yahusha sat at the supper table again for the second time. Remember, he uses the word again. Number 6, John has 5 statements that declare that there is a betrayer in the group. No one knows who the betrayer is except John, and the disciples felt that Judas had special regard as only he received the dipped sop. It was a gesture of highest regard in their culture. And the only time that John uses this term artos for leavened bread is after the foot washing at that second table. And this artos leavened sop was thoroughly dipped, and it was given to only Judas. And only John records that Judas removed himself from the group, leaving a leaven. John has some very, very different information. So why is John's gospel so different? The following are just some thoughts and questions for further consideration around this controversial bread in this study on the Last Supper. A fact is the Synoptic Gospels and actually the book of Acts were written well in advance of John's, varying from 40 to 69 AD. Matthew, Mark, and Luke were trying to reach those unconverted Jews, and Paul was chosen to try to reach the gospel, get the gospel to the Gentiles. So there was a lot going on. But another fact is that John's gospel was written between 90 and 100, over 20 to 50 years later, depending on which book he was looking at. Of the disciples and apostles, John was the longest living eyewitness. And by the time he wrote his gospel, he was focusing on the Roman and Gentile community. How do we know this? We know this because he used the Roman reckoning of time only for the Passion account. He used the dawn day start in the rest of his gospel. So John was obviously determined that his true Messiah was not going to be confused with any other counterfeit Messiah. Okay, he was going to get all the facts straight. So, could it be that John deliberately did not write about the events at the First Supper table because he knew that the kolne Greek word artos could not properly describe the unleavened bread Yahusha used at the first seating of the supper table? And he probably realized that that's exactly what was going to happen. They would put his work into Greek and up would come with that artos word. And the question is, why? And like I said, artos is first understood as leavened bread by the definition and by the Greek and Roman mindset. Artos, leavened bread, does not rightly represent the flesh of John's perfect and true Messiah, and he was not going to use any terms that would have kolne Greek come in and take over. Azumas, yes, indeed, it is the best word to absolutely verify the bread would be unleavened, but it was likely not the best word for the Greeks to understand that whole concept, as it was not a common word, and John just could not take the chance. Could these be the reasons that John deliberately chose to avoid recording the events around the unleavened bread and wine in that First Supper? I just bet that's the reason he made that choice. Well, we're ready to wrap it up with our third witness about artos in this bread study. And we want to look at patterns between type and antitype. Leavened bread conflicts. It absolutely does. There are some, though, that feel leavened bread could also represent Yahusha's body as the wine represents his blood. And in a lot of the Christian denominations today, they do serve leavened bread and their drink in churches, and you know that. There's a lot of confusion. And I think it's because of this word artos, a lot of confusion out there. Yahusha said that we are to partake of the bread as a representation of his body, and the wine is a representation of his blood. But some feel that the bread can or it must be leavened because of that Greek word artos. It is defined as leavened bread. Well, does that mean that the wine can also be leavened? Or is one of them leavened and one is unleavened? Matthew's Hebrew translation used the word lechem for bread. In Hebrew, this lechem can also have those two definitions. Is this likely the reason the Greek translation used artos rather than azumos? Because artos can have both definitions as well. In this study, we have discovered that both lechem and artos easily can take on both meanings of either leavened or unleavened. So how in the world do you settle this conflict? Well, maybe through patterns of type and antitype. Maybe that would work. Remember, we said that was something we have to remember. Would not the type and the antitype have the last word on the final answer to this bread controversy? Well, how about digging a little deeper to find how the type must link to the antitype for complete fulfillment in Yahusha, who is the true Messiah. Now remember, the type is the shadow of something that is going to come as the true. So antitype, I know it's an unusual term, but it does mean the true. It's the revealing of the true. So here's some examples. In the type, especially in Exodus 12, the Passover lamb sacrificed would have been the type for the antitype of Yahusha, who actually was our lamb for the Passover sacrifice. This type in the Exodus account or the Torah, this lamb or this Passover sacrifice has to be accompanied by a grain offering. And Yahusha, he also gives his body as the bread in linkage to the grain offering. You also have to have a drink offering with that sacrifice. And Yahusha said his blood is representative of the drink offering. Don't forget that the sacrifices were always accompanied with the grain offering, the drink offering, and they were always given on the altar of burnt offerings. Well, let's compare that to the antitype. Yahushua's pierced and striped flesh represents the grain offering. His spilled blood represents the drink offering. And his cross was his altar of burnt offering. So he is fulfilling all of the types. In Exodus 34:25, in the book of the law, it instructs about leaven. Look what it has to say. We're going to get to it in just a bit. But first of all, in Exodus 32, the people had just violated the covenant with that golden calf offense. But Exodus 34:25 is a very short, stern reminder after Moses came down from that Mount Sinai trip of what they were not to do regarding leaven. Idol worship links to paganism and to sin, and so does offering leaven with blood sacrifices. Therefore, this command was given before the sanctuary was set up. In Exodus 34:25, this is what it says very clearly. You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leaven, nor shall the sacrifice of the feast of the Passover be left until the morning. And you know what? This command is for all blood sacrifices on any altar, not just the altar of burnt offerings. And we're going to have more details in Leviticus 2 from the book of the law. Let's take a look at these scriptural requirements for grain offerings in Leviticus 2, verse 1. Really important to understand what's happening here. When anyone offers a grain offering to Yahuwah, his offering shall be a fine flour, and he shall pour oil on it and put frankincense on it. And we all know that salt was also a requirement. He shall bring it to Aaron's sons, the priests, and the priest shall burn it as a memorial on the altar, an offering made by fire. It's a sweet aroma to Yahuwah. It is most holy of the offerings to Yahuwah made by fire. Number 4, could be baked in an oven. It shall be on leavened cakes of fine flour mixed with oil, or on leavened wafers anointed with oil, or you could bake it in a pan, but it needs to be a fine flour, unleavened, and it has to be mixed with oil. So this means that the unleavened grain offering is a type to be fulfilled in the Messiah. Let's continue on in Leviticus 2 in verse 6. You shall break it in pieces and pour oil on it. It is a grain offering. Baked in a covered pan, it shall be made of fine flour with oil. You shall bring the grain offering to the priest. He shall bring it to the altar. Then the priest shall take from the grain offering a memorial portion and burn it on the altar. And what is left of the grain offering shall be Aaron's and his sons. It is a most holy offering to Yahuwah made by fire. Yes, the unleavened grain offering is offered with the blood sacrifice. It's very, very clear. But Leviticus 2 verse 11, this is where it gets extremely clear. No grain offering which you bring to Yahuwah shall be made with leaven, for you shall burn no leaven nor any honey in any offering to Yahuwah made by fire. Very, very clear. These detailed instructions are found in the book of the law. However, guess what? They are first given in the book of the covenant. We're going to examine it in Exodus 23:18. In the book of the covenant, instructions for the leaven. You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leavened bread, nor shall the fat of my sacrifice remain until the morning. Definite command, you shall not offer my blood with leaven. Well, what about the law of peace offerings? Peace offerings, it can be known as a Thanksgiving offering or a heave offering. It's got these 3 different different descriptions, but we find this in Leviticus 7, 11 to 14. And this is a very different offering, so I want to read it to you. This is the law of the sacrifice of peace offerings, which he shall offer to Yahuwah. Verse 12. If he offers it for a thanksgiving, then he shall offer with the sacrifice of thanksgiving unleavened cakes mixed with oil, unleavened wafers anointed with oil, or cakes of blended flour mixed with oil. Besides the cakes, as his offering, he shall offer leavened bread with the sacrifice of thanksgiving of his peace offering. So you see, we've got unleavened and leavened here already. And from it he shall offer one cake from each offering as a heave offering to Yahuwah. It shall belong to the priest, who sprinkles the blood of the peace offering. This is from the New King James. Do note that this leavened bread offering belonged to the priest. It does not go onto the altar. It is a unique offering, this peace offering. This sacrifice was offered in times of thankfulness. You could have it when you had peace, when you had joy, if you had a promise of a vow, when you had health and safety, redemption. If you were just thankful and happy, you could have this peace offering anytime that you wanted. It didn't have to be at a certain time. It was just there for anything. You've been home on a long journey and you had safety, you could go and have a peace offering. And a portion of that sacrifice was always given to the priest, along with several varieties of unleavened bread and cakes. And the rest of the offering was for the offerer, his family, his neighbors and guests, and also the poor. They were to enjoy themselves and have a banquet. This offering was to be eaten within 2 days, enjoying the feast and the fellowship, nothing lacking, and anything left over beyond the specified time was to be burnt. Being eaten meant the majority of this sacrifice was not offered upon the altar. However, besides those unleavened requirements, the offerer was also to bring leavened bread. Now, this is peculiar to only this offering, but never was this leavened bread offered upon the altar, for that was forbidden in Leviticus 2:11. Remember, we read it in the book of the law command. The leavened bread, that was to be eaten with the flesh of the sacrifice, so that the meal would be the most pleasant of all. And why? Because leavened bread is more desirable than unleavened bread. There are strict requirements for grain offerings on the altar of burnt offering. So let's be sure that we realize that the leaven requirement attached to the peace offering is unique, and that this leaven was never offered on the altar of burnt offering according to Leviticus 2:11. Don't forget, it says, no grain offering which you bring to Yahuwah shall be made with leaven, for you shall burn no leaven, nor any honey in any offering to Yahuwah made by fire. And those detailed instructions are found in the book of the law. That's where Leviticus 2 is. However, we all know they were first given in the book of the covenant in Exodus 23:18. You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leavened bread, nor shall the fat of my sacrifice remain until the morning. Let us never assume that Yahushua would ever describe his flesh as being likened to leavened bread, or his blood as being likened to leavened drink. Let's wrap it up here with final conclusions. Leavened bread should never be used when celebrating the ordinances of the Last Supper, and 3 witnesses testify to this. Luke 24 with the Emmaus account. That bread in the verse there was definitely unleavened, despite the fact that the Greek term artos was used, and that usually represents leavened bread. And remember, we said context was king. Absolutely, they would not have leavened bread in their homes in the middle day of the unleavened bread feast. In John 13:18, the bread in this verse used the Greek term artos as well, But this is correct, as the context is in connection with the artos sop that was given to the leavened Judas. So John used it correctly, or he made sure that if they used artos, that it was going to be right. And then we have the patterns of type and antitype. From both the Book of the Covenant and the Book of the Law, there are explicit instructions that no leaven is ever placed on the altar with the blood sacrifice to mar the identity of our true Messiah. So I say, everyone, choose ye this day. When you have a celebration of the Last Supper or of Yahusha for Passover, choose you today if your bread is leavened or not, if your drink is leavened or not. John says it's unleavened. And that's the end of part 2. I want to thank you so much for being with us today. If you have questions and comments, you can send them to questions@studythecalendar. And of course, the video will be uploaded to studythecalendar.com. I just want to tell everybody thank you and shalom, and have a wonderful Passover celebration.